All right, we're recording. Rebecca, take it away.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the follow-up to the planner's briefing for Puget Sound Parcel Scale Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment. And your hosts are myself, I'm a shoreline planner at the Department of Ecology, and Sydney Fishman, who works for Washington Sea Grant. She is a coastal management specialist. The Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group is a collaborative project of the Washington Sea Grant and the Washington State Department of Ecology. We're an educational group of coastal planners working for the federal, state, local, and tribal governments, nonprofits, conservation districts, and private consultants. We represent a multidisciplinary group of individuals. I'm going to hand this over to Sydney.
Yes, hi everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. If you're here today and you're interested in receiving AICP credits for attending, good news, we will be offering 1.5 credits for this webinar, and we'll have more information at the end and also in our follow-up email. But just know that if this is something that you're interested in, we've got you. And before we begin today, I do want to point out that today's meeting is guided by Washington Sea Grant's Engagement Code of Conduct. There's a QR code, and you can also find this on our website. This is going to be especially important because we'll be going into breakout rooms today, so you'll be interacting with your fellow participants. And I don't expect any trouble from anyone here today, but just know that in our group work today, please be respectful, be open to hearing other folks' perspectives. If you have any issues or concerns, please reach out to me, or there are other options outlined in the Code of Conduct. And just know that we are going to be interacting with each other today. And speaking of that, a note on breakout rooms. After today's presentation and some Q&A, we will be going into some breakout rooms to work on an elicitation survey, which you're going to be hearing more about from Ian. You will be able to choose your breakout room. You'll be able to stay in the main room, hop between rooms, lots of freedom here today, and we will not be recording those. So get excited.
Mhm.
And with that, please feel free to share questions in the chat. We are going to have two Q&A segments before breaking into those breakout rooms, and we will be recording this presentation to share on the SCPG website. So with that, let's switch it over to Ian for the presentation, and I'll get you spotlighted, Ian.
All right, thank you. And I am sharing my screen, so hopefully you can see that and hear me.
Everything looks great.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining today and being willing to participate in this particular, we're calling it a webinar, but it's going to be quite different because we are hoping to learn from you all. That is the point of today. And this is the title of this is Validating a Parcel-Scale Quantitative Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment for Puget Sound, Washington. I'm Ian Miller. I'm with Washington Sea Grant. And actually, Avery, do you want to go ahead and come off mute and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so I'm a coastal geologist with natural systems design, and I'm leading the technical and geospatial aspects of this project along with Jim Johannesson. I worked on the phase 1 of this project, and now I'm working on phase 2. And it's really great to be here, and thank you guys all for your input today.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go a bit over the plan for today, which hopefully you can see on the screen. So the intent for today is to provide a short briefing, very short, maybe 10 minutes on the Parcel-Scale Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment. Basically, very, very quickly, what it is, what we're trying to do, and how we're doing it. We're also going to provide a chance for you all to get a sneak peek at some of the draft exposure results. Then I'm going to transition to a run through of what we are calling the elicitation map tool. This is basically a survey that is the main feature of today. And the point of this survey is to ask experts like you all who know the landscape well in Puget Sound to provide information about places that you all view as vulnerable to sea level rise, so that we can use that as a data set to compare against the one that we are deriving as part of this project, which is effectively a GIS-based exercise to try to essentially map this idea of vulnerability on the landscape of Puget Sound. So after that run through, we'll then provide you with a link to the elicitation map tool, and then provide opportunities to discuss, ask questions, make sure everyone kind of understands the tool, and then hopefully use it and provide insight about those places. We will provide an opportunity for what we're calling sub-regional breakouts, just in case there's discussion that would be helpful to facilitate your thinking about places. And that'll be it for today. So I'm going to launch into, again, what's intended to be a very short briefing. First, note that this very short briefing is a follow-up to a much longer briefing, sort of a more traditional webinar that was provided for the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group on April 18th of 2025. A recording of that webinar is available on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website, so it's very easy to access. And if you find yourself wanting more information about the project, given how brief that overview is going to be today, I would encourage you to check out that recording. That is in regards to what we are doing currently in what we're calling phase 2 of this project. That's the sort of bit that we're in the middle of. This is a project that is funded by the Habitat Strategic Initiative. We did do a phase 1 that was completed in 2022, and there is a publicly accessible manuscript about that project. The link is shown here. It's titled "A Data-Driven Approach for Assessing Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Applied to Puget Sound, Washington, USA." That's also a great place to go for more insight about the project and to just get a general sense for what, the methods that we're applying in an effort to do this kind of idea of mapping vulnerability on the landscape. So how are we defining vulnerability? This is a really important part of not only understanding the project, but also when we get to the elicitation map for understanding the kind of places that we're looking for. So we are defining this idea of sea level rise vulnerability as being a function of exposure to hazards exacerbated by sea level rise. In our case, in the second phase, we are considering 3 hazards, and I'll go through these in a little more detail, but they are coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and groundwater rise interactions. And then we're going to couple that or interact it with what we're calling sensitivity. And sensitivity is trying to get at the consequences of the interaction of those hazards with things that we care about on the landscape. So what are the assets that are interacting with those hazards? And to what extent can we understand the consequences of that and map that information? So in our case, sensitivity for this project currently is focused on infrastructure sensitivity. And there we're sort of looking at things like interaction of flooding with buildings and roads. We incorporate information about critical assets from FEMA's HAZUS dataset. And then also habitat sensitivity. And there we're primarily trying to assess where where habitats are potentially pinched out because of this idea of coastal squeeze on the landscape. So that's kind of our 2 big sensitivity chunks. And I'll go through all these in detail, a little more detail. And then finally, ideally, vulnerability is assessed as well including this idea of adaptive capacity, which are any elements of a system that can be used to modify either exposure and sensitivity. We're actually not evaluating adaptive capacity. It's a really hard thing to quantify in a spatial data framework. And so instead, I will, at the very end of the briefing, I'll describe how we're integrating social vulnerability information as a way to start getting at the community scale elements that may influence this idea of vulnerability on the landscape. And just to sort of try to further illuminate this idea of vulnerability and its distinction from exposure to hazards, I wanted to use this map, which is one that I was part of creating for a project focused on climate adaptation on the Olympic Peninsula, where I live in Port Angeles. This was a project that we did around 10 years ago. And for this project, we created inundation maps. These are, many of you probably have seen or created or interacted with these kinds of maps before, in which we, lay inundation layers meant to represent future scenarios on the landscape. Typically coloring them in blue is very common, like you see here on this map of the Dungeness River Delta, and use this as a way to prompt conversations about potential impacts, potential interaction with important assets in these blue areas, and ultimately, hopefully, get at a shared sense for vulnerabilities associated with the exposure to this hazard. But one of the important things about this approach is that within that blue zone, vulnerability actually varies quite dramatically if we think about that interaction with sensitivity. So this is an aerial photograph of that same area on the Dungeness River Delta during a flooding event. And I've kind of used two white arrows to try to illustrate this idea that even within this flooding zone, where there are vulnerabilities is really influenced by where there are assets. So in this particular case, we see the interaction of that flooding with, in this case, houses. And I've kind of got another area that says, hey, maybe vulnerabilities aren't here because there's no assets there that we care about. Now, that's an assumption. There may be something there, but and there certainly are habitats there that might be influenced by this flooding, but hopefully sort of cements the idea that we're really looking for this interaction of those hazards exacerbated by sea level rise and the assets or values on the landscape that we care about. And it's really about trying to think of those two things together that gets at that concept of vulnerability. Okay, so how are we doing this as a spatial data exercise? And I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time advancing this slide. So let me see if I can just go. Okay, did that come up? Because I just had a...
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, all right. Oh, I did want to make one other point. This is obvious for probably most of you, but this concept of assessing vulnerability is a really important one in the conceptual frameworks for how we go about trying to adapt to climate change. This is a schematic of the adaptation cycle with a variety of steps. There's a whole bunch of versions of this out there, many of them that you probably know well. But this step number 2, assess risks and vulnerabilities to climate change, is one of those key steps, and that is where this project is intending to make a contribution. Okay, so again, just as a brief overview for the methods, noting that again, that you can find a longer description of that in the webinar from April 18th. As I mentioned, we're trying to evaluate the exposure to 3 separate hazards exacerbated by sea level rise, the first being coastal flooding. The way we are doing that is by taking inundation layers that represent 5 future scenarios, 2 2050 sea level scenarios, 2 2100 sea level scenarios, and a current 0 sea level scenario. So 5 of them, laying them over the landscape and basically measuring how much of every parcel in Puget Sound is inundated by those 5 scenarios. Those get summed, and that sum tells us something about the relative exposure to coastal flooding of the various parcels on the landscape. The results that I'm showing you here are for sort of the Bellingham Bay, and there's a little bit of the Skagit Delta poking out at the bottom there, with a legend in this particular case, kind of the deeper the red color, the more exposure to coastal flooding we evaluate for that parcel. The next one is this interaction with shallow groundwater. This is relying on new modeling for Puget Sound that we have available from the USGS Cosmos project. This kind of idea of groundwater interaction is new. We did not incorporate this in phase 1, but is intended to get at parts of these parcels that are exposed to shallow groundwater. Groundwater along the coast is sensitive to sea level rise. So as sea level rises, that groundwater may come up and start interacting with buried infrastructure, or in some cases emerge above the surface to actually cause flooding. Can be a big concern for agricultural areas, for example, can drive habitat changes. So we've incorporated it here. Same kind of construct. We're evaluating groundwater, shallow groundwater areas of the landscape in the same way that we did coastal flooding for 5 different sea level scenarios, scaling them in the same way. In this case, deeper green means more interaction with shallow groundwater at that parcel scale. And then the third hazard is coastal erosion potential. We don't have sort of explicit models that allow us to reference erosion to future sea level scenarios. So really what we are doing here is trying to evaluate a coastal erosion potential. This incorporates wave climate data and information about shore type. So for example, erosive bluffs are considered to be more sort of exposed to erosion than other types of shore types. So in this particular case, I'm showing results from the Elwha River Delta on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But again, mapping that erosion potential onto every parcel. We then subsequently sum these scores to come up with an overall exposure score for every parcel. Again, I want to emphasize the exposure. So far, we're ignoring anything about what's on that parcel. It's just about the relative exposure on every parcel. And we do have draft results for this particular element that you can take a look at. There is a QR code on the screen. I'm also going to drop a link into the chat. And to do that, I apologize. I'm just going to go grab this link. And you all can hopefully effectively follow that link. And the point of doing this is mostly just to see what these results look like. Again, this is exposure, so hopefully the results also make sense given the places that you all know well. But the main thing is just, what do the results look like? What does it look like when we map these things onto parcels as you sort of move to different parts of the landscape? So just to wrap up the briefing about the project, the next element that I mentioned is sensitivity. Again, the intent here is to try to get at that question about what is on that parcel that is interacting with these hazards that we care about, and integrate those into what we're calling a sensitivity score. This slide's a little messy, but I just wanted to sort of emphasize that it includes 2 elements. An infrastructure element in which we are trying to understand the interaction of those hazards with buildings, with roads, and with agricultural lands. New in phase 2, we're trying to integrate a distance from an eroding shoreline measure into our analysis, so that we can better evaluate the sensitivity of buildings to erosion. And then the second big element is associated with habitat sensitivity. Again, focused on this idea of trying to measure relatively those places on the landscape where that idea of coastal squeeze, losing coastal habitats because they're being pinched against either topography or armoring or something along those lines, is likely to occur. So those 2, this is upcoming, so I don't have draft results to share, but this will be integrated with those exposure measures that you're seeing the drafts of on the screen. and to come up with an overall, what we're going to call physical vulnerability score. The question that came up in the chat is a fantastic one, because one important thing that I forgot to mention is our constraints in regards to data. Any data that's incorporated in this project needs to be public, and it needs to be regionally consistent. We have to be able to go out and access a data set that is the same for the entirety of our study area, which is all of Puget Sound. So we do not include septics because there is no data set we have found that meets those criteria. There are data sets for septics available at the scale of counties, for example, but they've not yet been assembled, to our knowledge, into a region-wide data set. So septics are not included. Wells fall into the same category. Wells are also not included. Really, any buried infrastructure we don't have regionally consistent data about buried infrastructure. Okay, so I wanted to quickly again sort of talk about that adaptive capacity part, which we are not quantifying, not measuring at the scale of parcels, but we are integrating a social vulnerability index into the analysis. This is the one that was integrated into phase 1. We're evaluating what we will integrate into this phase 2. But these are, for those of you that are unfamiliar with social vulnerability indices, these are typically derived from census data and just compile different data sets from the census in order to evaluate, hopefully evaluate useful information about characteristics of these kinds of spatial zones. In this case, these are zip code tabulation areas that this social vulnerability index was created on. Incorporate into our vulnerability measure into something that we're calling socially modified vulnerability index. This isn't anywhere near adaptive capacity, but at least starts us down the line of hopefully incorporating useful information about the human communities on the landscape that tell us hopefully something useful about overall vulnerability to hazards exacerbated by sea level rise. And where are we currently at? So this phase 2 is currently very much in process. By this summer, we expect to have the spatial analysis complete. So we will have basically an updated geodatabase. And by the following summer, we will have a web portal for accessing those results. The geodatabase will be published. And basically, the project will conclude at that point. Alan's question is about storm events, and the answer is yes. So our flood hazard layers integrate water level associated with a 20-year storm event based on information from tide gauges. So that was our kind of chosen storm scenario for this project. Okay, so this second phase, besides the modifications and improvements to the spatial data, has two other big goals. The first of those, and the one that's going to be the focus for the remainder of our time here, is to assess the quality of the results, to go through a process akin to validation. I'll talk a little bit more about that concept. And then the other big thing is communicate the results by 2027. That'll be primarily through a web portal that's being developed in support of this project. So one of the approaches, we're following two approaches to try to accomplish this validation. And the one that we're focusing on today is the application of what we're calling the elicitation map or the elicitation survey. There is a QR code here for that, but I'm also going to go back to my links and grab and share a link.
Ian, were you going to pause for a little bit of Q&A about the project itself?
Oh, that's actually a really good idea. I'll do that before I share this. Link. Yeah, any questions about the project or the detail that I shared here? Again, noting that for a more full description, I would refer you to that recorded webinar on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website.
I will reshare the link for that. And let's see, Charlotte has a hand up, and I think folks can't unmute, so let me see. Charlotte.
Ooh, I think I can.
Okay. I wasn't sure. Sea Grant really locks down the Zoom permissions, but we can hear you, so go for it.
Okay, guess I can. Thanks so much, Ian. This is hopefully a quick question, and I was just hoping you could remind me, and maybe this is interesting to others, the geographic extent of the parcels that were included in the exposure analysis. Like in some areas along, like in our estuaries, delta areas, we have like further inland looks, so just visually. So I was wondering if you could just remind me how we did that for phase 2 here.
So basically, which parcels are included?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we so basically we created a set of thresholds for parcel inclusion, and we included every parcel that fell under an elevation of 30 feet relative to mean high water, I think was our datum for establishing the elevation threshold. So every parcel below 30 feet. And then we also included parcels above 30 feet if they were within 200 feet of the shoreline. So that allowed us to include, for example, parcels on the top of bluffs that were incorporating into this analysis because of that erosion vulnerability measure. And so you will see a much larger set of parcels included if you look at the draft exposure results, for example, than are currently mapped into the coastal zone, which is just that sort of 200 feet from the shoreline measure. And in total, I think our phase 2 database comes up at about 118,000 parcels.
Thanks, Ian. We had one more question in the chat from Lisa asking, could you take the septic and well data from the counties and pool them into a regional data set?
The answer is yes. As far as I know, no one has done that yet. And we did not have, that was something that we did not, propose to do in this project. Certainly would be a nice data set to have access to.
Wonderful.
And I did see a note that wells apparently may be available at statewide level. I will note as well that we're going to create this web portal, but we will also be publishing the geodatabase. And for our phase 1 results, we did the same thing. And what we did see is, people took those and incorporated other information into them, and that is also fantastic. So at the county scale, for example, septic's information.
Well, we are right on time. So Ian, do you want to go ahead and move on to the second part of your presentation? And we are going to have another Q&A, so please continue to think of questions and put them in the chat.
Okay. So I'm going to share in the chat the link for the elicitation survey, just so you can open it up and start to consider it. I am going to provide a little bit of an overview of it. So I would encourage you to pay attention to a couple of important considerations. So a few of those are listed here. I'm going to go through them in a little more detail down the line, but I'll just mention them here. So on that elicitation map, we're encouraging people that provide input to be specific about place. Providing insight about really one parcel is better than drawing a large polygon around an area that you view as generally vulnerable. Having that really specific information is going to be more useful to us. You can use the elicitation survey multiple times. You submit an answer, you can go back and do another one. There is no limit, and we encourage as many as you have time and patience to provide. Any input you provide is going to be super valuable and appreciated. And it's not a problem if you identify the same place as someone else. So, and in fact, that's going to tell us something useful, presumably, if 5 different experts mark the same location on the landscape. That's going to give us some insight about how vulnerable that place really is. So Link is in the chat. I'm going to move away from this QR code and just provide a little bit more detail. So first of all, the concept of validation is one that many of you may be familiar with, in which you take the results output from something like a model. This is just something I grabbed randomly off the internet that I think sort of tries to calculate modeled and observed boardings on an airplane, passengers, and basically compare those two things in this very simple way. This is effectively what we intend to do with the information that you provide today. We're looking to get experts like you all who know the landscape well to point to those places that you have either been to or evaluated or assessed or you know about through maybe a vulnerability assessment that your jurisdiction did that are viewed as vulnerable. And what we're going to do is compare that to whether this GIS-based exercise provides us with similar information. That'll help us to understand what it does well, what it doesn't do well, and allow us to be able to talk about the relative confidence that could be assigned to the results for different applications. So this is a really important step. And again, I just want to emphasize how much we appreciate your time and the input you can provide. So the elicitation map itself really has, I'm going to say, 3 big sections. So I'm going to go through those in detail. You can follow along if you wish. But the first is just overview information. There's links that take you to various bits and pieces about the project itself. And then there's this kind of text blurb that you encounter at the top that just re-emphasizes those things that I just said, especially this idea about being as specific about location as you can. Again, it's far more helpful to us if you outline, one parcel than if you outline the entirety of a community. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Then you're going to go, so that is going to include a map tool that you can use to actually mark your polygon. There's a polygon tool on there. You outline your parcel. And once that's complete, then you move down. There are 2 questions that are marked with red stars that are required. They need to be filled out for the response to be submitted. And those are questions that get at what are the hazards that are present on that parcel. You have the option of marking other or I'm not sure, but these, you'll see the top 3 align with the hazards that we are evaluating: coastal flooding, erosion, and groundwater rise. Below that is information that is optional. So really, we're just looking for any additional detail about that parcel that may provide useful insight when we get to the step of comparing it against our results. So for example, you can provide narrative information about impacts you've observed on that parcel. Maybe it was flooded during the December 27, 2022 storm. Maybe some other event. Maybe it floods very frequently, and that would be really nice information to have here. How quickly did that location recover after being impacted? So just some more narrative, qualitative information about the parcel. And then as you move down, there is a block of questions that are associated with you. So we'd love to have some insight about how you think you derived the information about the parcel that you've submitted information for. Does it come from living there? Does it come from your professional experience? Does it come from maybe a written report or something along those lines? Something that will allow us to evaluate, potentially evaluate sort of the type of information we're comparing it against when we get to the comparison step. We also have a couple of key questions, and I'm going to point to the one on the screen here. We have, when we've introduced this tool and in the process of developing it and sharing it with like the advisory group that we have for our project, there's been a lot of questions about whether the data set that we're compiling through this elicitation survey might be available as a data set. So this is not something that we originally envisioned. The first intent for this is to compare it to the Parcel-Scale data as a validation exercise. However, if you are comfortable with the information that you're sharing being published elsewhere, perhaps as a standalone data set, perhaps shared with other researchers, this question allows you to opt in or out of that option. And then finally, the information you're providing is anonymous, but if you prefer to include contact information that would allow us to follow up about about the information you provide, there's a box to allow you to do that. And that would be fantastic. Okay, so with that introduction to the elicitation tool, are there any questions? And I see that there's at least one in the chat. So the question is, what guidance do you have for selecting a vulnerability score between 0 and 10? That's a great question, Meredith, and thank you. So the Parcel-Scale vulnerability assessment, the results we're generating are intended to be relative across the 118,000 parcels in Puget Sound. And the idea behind including this quantitative question is it's going to allow us to most easily compare quantitative results. However, we don't have fantastic guidance about what should a 10 mean for you versus what should a 0 mean. I think in my mind, when I sort of first used this tool for areas that I know well, I kind of thought first of like, where's the place that I just view as being most problematic from a vulnerability standpoint on the landscape. And I ranked that one high. I gave it a 10 or a 9 or something like that. And then I sort of moved down from there. I actually chose to do some zeros as well, right? You can sort of like outline some parcels that you just are like, this is not a problem place. Maybe it's a shoreline parcel that is on a bedrock bluff. It's on the shoreline, but it's not exposed to erosion. Marking that as a 0 might be totally valid. So it's really just trying to get at your relative assessment based on the places that you know well.
Maybe Ian, if you want to stop sharing and Rebecca can bring up the guidance about the breakout rooms so we can make sure to have that going. But in the meantime, we do have a couple more minutes for Q&A if anyone wants to provide that. And Rebecca, that looks great.
And this would also be the point to certainly start working through the elicitation survey if you want. And there was a question also about, is today's entry intended to be, which is actually a great one because I forgot that point. Is it an exercise today, or are we really trying to collect data? And we are really trying to collect data today. That is the hope, is that we've got the right people in the room who know the landscape well, at least, maybe a part of the landscape well, and can provide that insight. If you want to just try it out, and maybe you sort of feel like, hey, I actually don't know the landscape that well, or I don't have confidence in the information I'm providing, in the narrative text entry boxes, there's 2 of them that say, has this location been notably impacted by any previous events? It's just a text entry box. Or if it says, is there anything else you'd like to share about this location? Also just a free text entry box. You can still go through the survey and in those boxes just write, I made this up, or something that will tell us that you were just doing it as an exercise and we should ignore the results that you've input. But largely today, we are really hoping to actually use this elicitation survey to start to build our database of places that, you all who know the landscape well view as vulnerable to sea level rise in Puget Sound.
Your input matters.
Your input matters.
Maybe we'll give it one more moment for Q&A. You can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat, but noting that we will be breaking into breakout rooms in a moment. Once we know we're done with this Q&A, I'll stop the recording and I will make sure that everyone can unmute and turn their videos on so it's a little bit more personal in the breakout rooms. We will have two options that you can choose, and partially this is just to try to manage the group size, and if there are questions, you'll either be with Ian or with Avery, but you can also move between rooms. You don't have to only submit North Sound parcels if you're in the North Sound room. It's just, we got to break the group up somehow, so we picked by geography. As I said, yeah, you can bounce between rooms. You can also stay in the main room where Rebecca and I will be. But again, if you have questions about the project, please go to one of the breakout rooms because Rebecca and I don't know that much. And Ian and Avery are our experts. And we will be reconvening by 11:15. But I will be entering the rooms and just seeing how it's going. If we're done early, we don't have to just hang out in the rooms for no reason.
Yeah.
I think with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording. So thanks everyone who was watching. Thank you for viewing after the fact.